Hello everyone, welcome to my class. Today we are going to discuss about water absorption in plants. So if we talk about water absorption, so if we define water absorption, it is basically uptake of water by plants. The way how plants absorb water, we call the mechanism of uptake of water by plants, we call it water absorption, right? So along with water, it is not only the water, but along with water, there are certain dissolved nutrients or minerals which gets mixed with water, and as a whole, the plants absorbed it, right? And this absorption or this uptake of water by plants, we call it absorption in plants, right? So site of water absorption, water is mainly absorbed by root hairs. We all know plants have got roots and shoots. Last class I told you, right? So water, where we pour water over the soil. So I told you last class that under the soil roots are present. So these roots will absorb the water, right? From roots, water is carried to different parts of the plant through xylem, right? Next, what is xylem now? I told you that the water is absorbed by the root hairs from the soil, and then once it is in the root, it is transported to other parts of the plant through xylem. Now, what is xylem? Xylem is one of the two types of transport tissue. What are two types of transport tissue? That is xylem and phloem. So what does xylem do? It carries water and it carries photosynthetically prepared food from leaves to different parts of the plant, right? Now let us have a look little bit about xylem. What is xylem, right? So xylem is a type of transport tissue. It is a dead tissue, very important. I can ask you question in 1 marks also. What is xylem? It is a dead tissue. It is not a living tissue. Xylem tissue is made up of cells known as xylem elements, right? So four types of cells are present in xylem. These are vessels, tracheids, xylem fiber, and xylem parenchyma, right? So these vessels and tracheids, this both helps in transportation of water and mineral, right? Vessels and tracheids helps in water transportation and mineral. Vessels basically help in angiosperm. Angiosperm are basically flowering plants, right? And tracheids helps in gymnosperms. Means tracheids carries water and minerals in gymnosperms, and vessels carries water and mineral in angiosperm. What is the function of xylem fiber? It provides support to the plants, right? Xylem parenchyma, what is the function of xylem parenchyma? It helps in storage and secretion. Clear? It is out of, I told you that xylem is entire dead tissue. All these vessels, tracheids, xylem fiber are dead except xylem parenchyma. It is living tissue. Clear? So if I ask you what is the living tissue in xylem, it is xylem parenchyma, because rest xylem is dead tissue. Only the xylem parenchyma of xylem are living cells. Now, if we talk about absorption of water, there are two stages or two ways by which water gets absorbed. First is absorption of water through the root hairs, and second is ascent of sap. So if I tell you, say this is a plant here, these are roots, right? And say this is a plant. So what will happen? The water will be absorbed from the soil by root hair. Now from this root hair, the water needs to travel upward, right? So this upward travel of water against gravity, we call it ascent of sap. What is ascent of sap? Upward movement of water against gravity. We call it what? We call it ascent of sap. And this water, the process by which root cells absorb water, we call it diffusion, right? This is what is the first stage. So this entire stage is the first one, and this movement of water upward from the root hairs to upward, that is what we call ascent of sap. Clear? Now in this class we will be discussing this one, absorption of water through root hairs. Next class we will see ascent of sap. Now coming to absorption of water by root hairs. You all know, right? What? Root hair, absorption of water. See, this is roots, these are plants. So what happen here when we pour water here? This root here will absorb water. Why? How it absorbs? See, over on the soil, the concentration of water is high, and in the roots, the concentration of water is less. So water will move from higher concentration to lower concentration, right? So this concentration movement, we call it passive because here no energy is needed. It is moving along the concentration from higher to lower, right? So this type of process from water from soil to root here, because soil, when you pour water over soil which is having higher concentration of water, soil or root here? Soil, because you have directly poured in on the soil, right? So now water will move from soil to your roots, right? And this movement is taking place from higher concentration to lower concentration, right? So this movement is known as passive movement because there is no involvement of ATP. What is ATP? Energy, right? So this movement of water through a cell membrane is the result of two processes, diffusion and mass flow. So I already told you last class, passive process, diffusion, right? From higher concentration to lower concentration. Clear? Now see here, if I tell you this is a plant, if you say this is a plant, right? This is root. So water is here, water is poured over the soil. Now this roots will absorb the water. How? By a passive process. What is passive process? Which is along the concentration gradient. What is along the concentration gradient? That means when water moves from its higher concentration to lower concentration, we call it is along the concentration gradient. And here from higher to lower water is moving, so there is no involvement of energy. So it is also known as passive process, right? So this is root hairs which will absorb the water. Clear now? Now, if this part of root, if I enlarged it, if you see this is a root, but this part if I enlarged it, how it looks? It looks, this is what root here, which will absorb the water. Clear? Now, from root here, the very next layer from root here is your epidermis, right? Then cortex, then endodermis. In the endodermis, there are specialized cells. These cells are known as Casparian strips. Clear? Then present your phloem and xylem. Clear? So if I tell you about a root, if you say this is a root, right? This is a root. This is what we see root. But if you see the internal morphology of the root, this looks something like this. Clear? This is root here. Just next to root here is your epidermis, then cortex, endodermis. Now inside the endodermis there are very specialized cells. We call it Casparian strips. Clear? Just next to Casparian strips are present phloem and xylem. So water will be moving from epidermis to cortex, cortex to endodermis, endodermis to Casparian strips, phloem, xylem. So here if I give you a code language to remember this, what is this? E, C, E, C, P, X. That is epidermis, cortex, endodermis, Casparian strips, phloem, xylem. So it will be, if you write EC whole square PX, this is a code to remember the layers of root. Clear? Next, this is a diagram. See how water is absorbed. Water is absorbed by root hairs, and the process by which water is absorbed, it is known as diffusion, right? Also known as passive process. Clear now? Now from this root here, what will happen? This is how water move to your epidermis. From epidermis, it will move to your cortex. From cortex, it will move to your endodermis, right? Endodermis. Then EC square, again Casparian strips. Then phloem, xylem. Clear? This is how your water moves. We will see now in detail this part. Clear? So here Casparian strips. Out of epidermis, cortex, endodermis, we need to know a specialized cells which is present within the endodermis, that is known as Casparian strips. Why we need to know about this cells only? Because it has a function which is unique from rest of the other cells, right? So we'll see this now. Now, if you see, Casparian strips are band of cell wall material deposited in the wall of endodermis. So, if you see in the diagram itself, this is epidermis, cortex, EC whole square. Epidermis, cortex, endodermis, Casparian strips. Just within the endodermis, there are present are cells known as Casparian strip. Why it is unique from other? Because this Casparian strip is made up of suberin and lignin, right? As it is made up of suberin, rest all cells do not have the suberin, right? As this cell is made up of suberin, it do not allow the water to pass through it. That means these Casparian strips are impermeable to water. So water has to change its path. We will see how water flows in epidermis and cortex, how it flows in Casparian strips. Clear? So here, why Casparian strip is unique from other? Because it is made up of suberin and lignin, which makes Casparian strips impermeable to water. Right? Rest alls are permeable to water. Rest all means who? Epidermis, cortex, xylem. Right? Now we'll see this. So this movement of water through root cell basically explained in three pathways: apoplastic pathway, symplastic pathway, and transmembrane pathway. Now what is apoplastic pathway? We will see this. Sorry. Apoplastic pathway, water from soil enters into the root hairs by osmosis or diffusion. Osmosis and diffusion is same thing only, right? Osmosis we talk about solvent, and in diffusion we talk about solvent, and in case of osmosis we talk about the solute. Last class I told you, right? The water through cell wall or intercellular space comes up to Casparian strips. Maximum water through apoplast pathway. So what is apoplastic pathway? If you see this is a diagram. This is the three pathway by which water is transported from root hair to xylem. So if you see this pathway, this is apoplastic pathway. So in apoplastic pathway, if you see, this is a cell, right? And this is cell wall, and this is cell membrane, and this one we call it inside one. If I just give me 1 minute, I will show you how the cell looks like. See, this is a cell. This is what we call cell wall. Now this one we call it cell membrane, right? And this one we call cytoplasm. So in case of apoplastic pathway, what will happen? Water will enter in the cell wall. That means water will travel through the cell wall. It will never come to your cytoplasm part. Means water will never enter in this area. Clear? Only the movement of water takes place through two cell wall. Right? Like you see, water never entered within the cell. Right? So this movement of water we call it apoplastic pathway. Clear? What is apoplastic pathway? That means water is moving through the cell wall. It is not moving inside the cell. Clear? It is moving through the cell wall or intercellular space. What is intercellular space? Yes, the space between these two. We call it intercellular space, right? So it is moving through cell wall. Coming to symplast pathway. In case of symplast pathway, what is happening? Water is moving through the cell. Water is crossing the cell. Water moves between the cytoplasm. If you see this, in case of symplastic pathway, how water moves? Water directly moves inside the cell. But in apoplastic, see, it is not moving inside the cell. It is moving through the cell wall. But here in case of symplastic movement, water moves inside the cell. Why it is moving inside the cell? Because why? Casparian strip is present in the endodermis. So this Casparian strip is made up of suberin and lignin, which will block the apoplastic movement of water. I will show you a diagram in the next slide, then it will be more clear to you. Clear? Now in this slide, what you need to know is what is apoplastic pathway. That means how in apoplastic pathway, how water moves. It moves through the cell wall. But in case of symplastic pathway, water will move inside the cell. It will cross the cytoplasm or protoplast, right? So here if you see, it is entering the cell. Yes, it is crossing the cell. This is what we call symplastic pathway. Next is your transmembrane pathway. In case of transmembrane pathway, what is happening? Water is entering from one side and leaving the cell from another side. Again entering from one side, leaving the cell from another side. So this is how it looks. See, water is entering from this side, leaving from the next side. Right? Again, in the adsorption cell, this cell also water will enter from one side, leaving the another side. This is what we call transmembrane pathway. Clear? So if I define you apoplast, symplast, so see, this is what we call cell wall, right? So in apoplastic pathway, water is moving through the cell wall. See, this is what we call apoplastic pathway. Clear? And this is water is entering inside the cell. Inside the cell. What? Water is inside the cell. This is what we call symplast pathway. And here if you noticed, what? Water is entering from one end, leaving the cell from other end. It is not like water is entering from this and leaving also from this end. No. Water is entering from one end and leaving the cell from another end. Same here, this cell. For this cell, water is entering through this side and leaving the cell through this side. For this cell also, water is entering through this side and leaving the cell through this side. So this is what we call transmembrane pathway. Clear now? What is apoplastic pathway? Water absorptions, water movement through cell wall. Symplast, water movement through cytoplasm or protoplast, right? And in transmembrane, water enters through one end of the cell and leave from the other end of the cell. And this happens in a series of cells. This is one cell, this is two cell, yes, this is third cell. So this is what we call transmembrane pathway. Clear? Now if you see this is what I need to explain you. This is a root, right? So if you see this is what we call root here. So water is entering from the soil through root here, right? So it enters the epidermis. In the epidermis, which pathway is followed? In the epidermis, apoplastic pathway is followed. That means water will move through the cell wall. You see, water is not entering inside the cell. It is moving. You see, it is moving through the cell wall, right? So this is what is apoplastic pathway. Clear? So in the epidermis, what is happening? Epidermis also, water is what? Epidermis also, what is happening? Water is moving apoplastic. This cortex also, water is moving what? Apoplastic. But if you see, let me tell you, if you see what? If you see this endodermis part, this one endodermis, it is moving inside the cell. If you see this, what you have seen? It is moving inside the cell, and this is what we call it symplastic pathway, because it is moving inside the cell. This is what we call symplast pathway. Then again in you can see what? Again in phloem, it is moving through cell wall or apoplastic pathway. So what we understood from this? We understood that in case of epidermis, what is the root layers? We know root hairs, right? After that, EC whole square, epidermis, cortex, endodermis, Casparian strips, phloem, and xylem. So what we have seen, in case of epidermis, cortex, water will move through apoplastic pathway. Apoplastic pathway. What is apoplastic pathway? That means the water is moving. If I show you the apoplastic pathway here, it looks like this is a cell, right? It is moving through the cell wall. In the endodermis, especially, you have a Casparian strip. So this Casparian strips, it will move how? Symplastic pathway. Symplastic pathway. Now what is symplastic pathway? As I told you, water will enter inside the cell. Clear? Now, phloem and xylem, again from phloem and xylem, water will move through apoplastic pathway. Clear? This is how is the pathway, and root hair will absorb the water by diffusion, which is your passive process. Clear now? Yes? So in short, if I tell you, this is root hair, right? Water will go from root hair to epidermis. From epidermis, it will go to cortex, right? Then endodermis. In the endodermis only, it is present a Casparian strips. Casparian strips, right? From endodermis, Casparian strips, it moves to your phloem, and then it moves to your xylem, right? So this movement from root hair, the water will be absorbed. Water gets absorbed through root hair. This is water. How this absorption takes place? This takes place through diffusion, right? From root hair to epidermis, apoplastic pathway. From epidermis to cortex, again apoplastic pathway. From cortex to endodermis, again apoplastic pathway. But this endodermis to Casparian strips, which pathway? It will be your symplastic pathway, right? Again in phloem, your apoplastic pathway. Then it reaches xylem, apoplastic pathway. Now what does xylem do? Xylem carries the water to remaining parts, to different parts, and these different parts we call ascent of sap, and this we will be looking into next class, ascent of sap, and this ascent of sap will be discussing in the next class. Is this clear to everyone? If in case if you have any doubt, please feel free to contact, right? If you have any doubt, just let me know. Thank you so much students for attending the session. Thank you.